January 2nd, 2020, second day of the new year.
The boiler in the main character's small apartment stopped working. A guy with dark hair and a blue t-shirt looks at the steam-shrouded pipes, frowning. He thought he must have rented a house where the boiler was already on the verge of breaking down. Slapping his slippers on the floor, an elderly man shouted that young people do not know how to save on heating at all. Waving his broom, he yelled at them to just put on their socks and seal up the windows. The residents looked at him from their apartments. The man shouted that he told them not to load the boiler so much. The main character thought irritably that this old man had previously hinted to him that the boiler would not hold up at some point. He thought that if he went and told him now that the boiler was broken, he would definitely blame it on him, tell him to pay for the repairs and then raise the rent because he didn't take good care of the house or something. He thought that he would be happy to bury it somewhere in the yard, but there would be problems later. The wind was blowing in the shabby apartment and cobwebs were visible in the corner. The main character thought that his life since childhood was hard and painful, so a nice shower suits him even more than a hot one. Shivering from the cold, he hugged his hands and sneezed. He thought that this room was rather cold. He thought that maybe the old man's words had brainwashed him, because he almost immediately went to buy film to cover the windows. He stood at the entrance to the balcony, shivering from the cold. The main character thought it was called the butterfly effect. A flutter of a wing can cause a hurricane on the other side of the planet. Back then, he didn't know that an ordinary broken boiler would completely change his life. January 2nd, 2020, 9 o'clock in the evening, a guy wearing a black hoodie asked a store employee where the film was stored here. The girl replied with a smile that she was to the right of a large pillar with the letter F. He walked along the store shelves and thought that they really did have everything. The child, holding a wrench in his hand, asked his father if he would buy him one. The man in the blue shirt asked why he needed a wrench. He told him to put it down. Brandishing a wrench, the child said that it has a very comfortable handle. The protagonist thought that Lee Wai-young was, according to the owner of the shelter, a name given to him by a father he had never met. He thought about how Wa means peaceful and Yun means reach. Putting his hands in his pockets, he reflected that, for the owner of a name that meant peaceful achievement, he was living the exact opposite life. His parents abandoned him as a child, and the shelter gave him only a roof over his head and food. Two larger boys dressed in white beat up a frightened little boy. Little Lee Wai-young will punch another boy in the face with his fist while the adult tries to hold him down. Lee Wai-young thought that this place had reinforced his belief that he should become stronger. He decided that money was the main source of power, so all he did was work, even in high school. Unfortunately, with poor educational success and no income, he could not count on anything but part-time work. Lee Wai-young, dressed in a courier's work clothes, gives the package to the customer. He gives him money in return, and the main character takes it, his eyes narrowing in displeasure. If Lee Wai-young has learned anything during his career, it's that the price of his time is a pittance. He thought of the world as a cruel place. Lee Wai-young stands in front of a rack with a machete. Smiling, he picked up the machete in his hand and thought about how stylish it looked. The girl quietly asked the guy with the cart what was wrong with the main character, and why he was smiling with a machete in his hands. The guy said he didn't know and said he wouldn't go near him. Lee Wai-young's smile was reflected in the machete blade, and he thought that it brought back memories. When Lee Wai-young realized that his hard work wasn't worth 10,000 won even if he sold himself into slavery, and that orphans couldn't serve in the military, he became a mercenary and participated in countless wars around the world as a member of the First Squad. The First Squad is an international mercenary band made up of orphans and social outcasts. In other words, those who have nothing to lose. People like Lee Wai-young were given a bed, clothes, and money for the rest of their lives. He couldn't help but be grateful. They teamed up, getting rid of pirates in the seas and beheading terrorists on land. Sometimes, Lee Wai-young even participated in international wars to earn his own price. Putting her hands on the machete, the salesgirl said that it was worth 240,000 won. She asked him what he was buying it for. She explained that it was much more suitable for a collection than for logging or camping, and said she could show him more practical machetes. Lee Wai-young replied that it was fine and it suited him. He had been thinking about buying a new machete for a long time, because it was very blunt and it was enough for him to hold it in his hands to feel its power. The main character pointed his finger at the film behind the saleswoman and asked for 10 meters. The girl began to cut off the film with a stationary knife. The cut was rough and jagged. Lee Wai-young thought irritably that this knife was so blunt that she couldn't even cut straight. He told her to stand back. The saleswoman raised her head questioningly. Lee Wai-young raised the machete and swung it in front of him. She stared at the neatly cut film in surprise. The main character turned around when he heard the noise. A crowd of people were bustling around something, saying that it was like someone was real. Someone asked me to take a picture with him. A huge shadow fell over the surprised people. Lee Wai-young's eyes widened in surprise. A small goblin with a knife jumped at the fleeing people. The fleeing guy looked back in surprise. The goblin leaped towards him with a vicious smile, swinging its knife. Blood gushed out of the guy's body. He fell to the ground dead, and the goblin crouched down in front of him. The main character paled in surprise and thought that he looked like a goblin from a video game. The goblin was devouring the corpse with an evil smile. He turned to Lee Wai-young with a bloody mouth. The main character recoiled in surprise. The goblin leaped at him, knife in hand. Lee Wai-young chopped off his head with a swing of the machete. He asked me what was going on here. Shopping center building. The floor of the trading floor was smeared with blood, and there were bodies and trash everywhere. A scream rang out. Lee Wai-young was breathing heavily, smeared with green blood. He was holding a machete. Frowning, he thought that the smell of blood was unbearable. When he heard the cry for help, he turned around. There were bloodied bodies on the floor. A few goblins are standing there, smiling maliciously. The woman covers the little girl, and they tremble in fright. She is frightened and asks for help. The main character swung his machete, cutting one of the goblins in half. The woman asked what was going on and where they were coming from. The little girl snuggled up to her chest in fright. The main character looked at them blankly. He looked down at his machete in exasperation and thought that with this blade, it was more of a crushing weapon than a cutting one. He decided that he needed to find something more suitable. His eyes widened in surprise. There was a huge crowd of goblins in front of him. Gritting his teeth and thrusting the machete forward, he thought that they weren't running out. The guys behind nothing let out a battle cry. Several guys are fighting goblins with improvised means. The guy in the black t-shirt hit the goblin's head with an axe. A guy with blue hair and red glasses was sitting in a corner, holding his head in his hands and shaking, begging God to save him. A chainsaw blade appeared in front of his face, and he raised his head. Lee Wai-young told him that this wasn't a dream and panicking wouldn't help. He told him to get up if he wanted life and added that prayers would not save him. The main character thought that right now, he just wanted to increase the number of goblins resisting. The four guys took up a fighting stance. The guy in the black t-shirt is armed with an axe, the guy with blonde hair is armed with a nail gun, and the guy with glasses and the main character is armed with chainsaws. The bespectacled guy turned around when he saw the goblin approaching. He cut his head open with a chainsaw. Lee Wai-young turned to him and praised him with a smile. The guy looked down in shock, covered in green blood. The main character thought that even if someone is weak in body and spirit, the instinct of self-preservation will give them the strength to survive. The guy in the gray shirt called them to look away. The black sphere was wrapped in a bright vortex of blue energy, shielding his face from the light with his hand. Lee Wai-young said that he was sure that the monsters were coming from there and they needed to destroy this thing. The guy in the gray shirt asked how they should do it. He said he didn't know. Two goblins emerged from the portal with vicious smiles. Among the shelves of the store, the bloodied bodies of humans and goblins lie on the floor. Lee Wai-young and a guy with glasses are hiding behind a display case. The protagonist thought that things were only getting worse and the number of goblins climbing out of the rift hadn't decreased at all and the resistance energy was plummeting. No one can even imagine how to get rid of them once and for all. The main character looked out from behind the shelter and thought that their appearance was also inexplicable. The spatial rift that the goblins come out of would have thrown even the most brilliant scientists into disarray. Several goblins devoured the corpse of a woman. Lee Wai-young counted from 5 to 1. The guy with glasses asked what he was talking about. The main character replied that there are 10 goblins in each wave and there are exactly 10 minutes between each wave. Frowning, he said there were 26 of them now and in 10 minutes there would be 10 more. The biggest problem is that even if Lee Wai-young understands the whole situation, he doesn't know how to resolve it. In addition, not everything in this store is a good weapon. Heavy weapons such as axes, crowbars, chainsaws, and sledgehammers will consume too much energy and yet they can only be used in close combat, face-to-face with monsters. One wrong step and you can become their food. Many of the people in the store are already dead and those who fought at full strength look completely exhausted. Gritting his teeth, Lee Wai-young thought that things would be different if he had a firearm. Someone gave the command, fire. There was a flash in the muzzle of the rocket launcher. They noticed the explosion behind them. Several armed soldiers entered the room and they announced that the counter-terrorism task force of the Metropolitan Defense Command was speaking. They said they were under their protection from now on. They told them to help the wounded and move towards them.
A tank entered the room. Soldiers are firing automatic weapons.
The goblin is shot in the back before it can attack the man with the child in front of it. The shop assistant covered her head with her hands as the shot hit the goblin behind her.
Lowering the chainsaw, Lee Wai-young exhaled.
The goblin's corpse fell to the floor in front of him, spilling green blood. The guy with glasses thanked the main character. He said with an awkward smile that his name was Kim Bo-won. The main character indifferently replied that he was tired. He stood up and turned away, telling him to go where he needed to go. He thought that he was tired of weaklings. One of the main lessons he'd learned from his years as a mercenary was that weak people were the heaviest burden. Lee Wai-young doesn't want to drag around with ballast, especially when the danger isn't over yet. Kim Bo-won gritted his teeth in fright as he held the chainsaw in his hands. The main character thought that with the arrival of armed soldiers, the need for someone like Kim Bo-won became even less. He walked over to the soldiers who were shooting at the goblins. Gritting his teeth, he cursed. He noticed that the soldiers' breathing was labored and their stance was unstable. He concluded that they were not much better than he was.
Goblins rushed forward, dodging bullets.
Lee Wai-young gritted his teeth. He held out his hand to the soldier and told him to give him the machine gun. He said that he was Lee Wai-young, a member of the first squad. Surprised, the soldier asked me to repeat it. Lee Wai-young snatched the submachine gun out of the soldier's hands with an indifferent face.
Another soldier started swearing, asking how he even let them take his weapons.
The main character took aim. The soldiers shouted to detain him. Lee Wai-young started firing his submachine gun, effectively taking out the goblins. The soldiers looked at him in surprise.
One of them asked if he was imagining it.
Another said that he was from the first squad. The soldier asked in surprise if he was talking about the most ruthless mercenary group in the world.
Lee Wai-young was firing a submachine gun with an indifferent expression on his face. The shot hit the goblin in front of the boy and girl.
A soldier standing behind the main character motioned for the woman with the child to follow him.
The shot hit the goblin in the chest.
Soldiers helped people evacuate amid bloodied shopping malls. The dialogue box says, "Game restart."
Lee Wai-young looked at the dialogue box in surprise.
He clutched his head, closing his eyes. He thought about how incredible things had happened one after another from the moment he entered this shop, but his head only started to ache with the appearance of this window in front of his eyes. The main character thought that he doesn't know what kind of game it is, but the fact that it says reload, not load, confuses him even more. He had never seen such hideous monsters or something like that spatial rift. No one in this hardware store had ever seen anything like it.
A monster's arm emerged from the rift.
Turning away from the dialogue box, Lee Wai-young decided that trying to understand what was going on would be stupid. It occurred to him that things had happened since he'd come to this store that couldn't be logically explained. He turned around in surprise when he heard a loud sound.
A huge orc emerged from the rift and let out a loud roar.
Soldiers fired automatic weapons at him as people hurriedly ran away from the store. The orc covered his face from the bullets with his hand.
Bullets bounced off his body.
The main character shot at him, gritting his teeth, and shouted that they had no effect on him. The main character and soldiers fire at the orc with machine guns as it slowly approaches them.
Someone jumped, swinging an axe.
Kim Boon sliced through the orc's legs with a swing of his axe. Standing behind the fallen orc, she said that the lower half of the orc's body is its weakness, and if you make them lose their balance, it will not be difficult to deal with them.
Lee Wai-young looked at him in surprise as he lowered his weapon. The soldier in the back asked who the guy was. The protagonist was surprised to think that this person was definitely a weakling. Just half an hour ago, he had been cowering in a corner and trembling at the sight of the little goblin, but the one who had just dealt with the orc without any problems seemed to know absolutely everything. Kim Boon chopped off the orc's head with an axe blow. He dealt with it with confidence and precision. Kim Boon stands over the dead orc with a calm face. The main character and soldiers are standing in front of a dead orc. Several more orcs emerged from the rift. Kim Boon calmly turned around. Lee Wai-young opened his mouth in surprise.
A small boy with a wrench in his hand charged, swinging the wrench. The main character realized that this is the same boy who a couple of hours ago begged his father to buy him a wrench. Fighting orcs with only the knowledge of their vulnerabilities is reckless, especially with such a small and fragile body. However, he cuts up orcs as if he has dozens of years of experience. The boy kicked the orc's legs and it fell to the floor.
Li Huayang turned around in surprise. The saleswoman was twirling the chain in the air like a lasso. He thought about how the employee who cut his film was acting the same way and killing orcs left and right, and only a cold calmness could be seen in her eyes. She swung the chain, and the orc fell forward, smashing his face into the ground. The man named Kim Boon, who was currently chopping down an orc with an axe, is the same guy who fell to his knees and prayed at the sight of a goblin. Like this boy who begged his dad like a normal child, like the employee who spoke to him with kindness and gentleness. The main character doesn't understand what's going on here. The soldier ordered a ceasefire. The people behind Li Huayang cheered that their prayers had been answered and they were saved. He wondered what the difference was between those who had changed dramatically and were fighting the orcs and the others, and what was the reason for this transformation. A blue dialogue box appeared in front of Li Huayang's face. It says, "There is no training here. However, you can ask 3 questions about the game. Choose your questions wisely." The main character drew attention to the words about training and questions. The mercenary squad stands with weapons in their hands, and in front of them stands Li Huayang with a machete in his hand. Their eyes glow blue. Li Huayang has a nickname that was given to him when he joined the most ruthless mercenary group in the world and fought in countless wars: fearless, someone who is not afraid of anything. It was invented by foreigners from his squad as he always kept calm and reasonable, regardless of the situation. Thanks to these traits, he could survive in disorderly battles, among numerous shells and debris. The blue dialogue box says, "The right to ask questions is given to all people selected to become players." Li Huayang once again realized that trying to understand the situation was a stupid idea. Looking at the dialogue box, the main character said that this is no longer funny. He thought that he had no doubt that the writing before his eyes, like everything else that had happened, was real. Dead orcs and goblins lie on the floor, hacked to pieces. Li Huayang asked what was going on here. He said it was his first question. A voice came out of the dialogue box saying that this is the end of the world and a system designed to test humanity. And this is a combination of video game features that people like so much. The main character strictly said to stop talking nonsense. The dialogue box told him to choose his questions wisely and added that he didn't have to ask them right now. Frowning, Li Huayang thought that this mechanical voice sounded like a woman's and it annoyed him. He thought that if he could break through monsters with brute force, it wouldn't work here, because he didn't have a physical body and only communicated through text and voice. A voice from the dialogue box told the main character that the status window was available from now on. The dialogue box says that the status window is unlocked. A voice from the dialogue box said that people all over the world were chosen to become players and he is currently in Korea. The voice asked him to call up the status window. Raising an eyebrow, he was about to say that he didn't care about the status window, but he was interrupted by the status window appearing in front of him. Li Huayang chuckled nervously. He thought it was getting more interesting and the delusional report about video games in the real world turned out to be true. The voice from the dialogue box said that this was proof that he had become a player and that there were gates all over the world. The voice said that these gates are connected to dungeons, but the main character interrupted him and asked if he understood correctly that he needed to train to cope with monsters and prevent humanity from dying out. He thought that as soon as the system mentioned video games, the situation became a little clearer, and instead of listening to him talk, he wanted to ask a more important question. A voice from the dialogue box told him that he was learning fast. Li Huayang asked why the boy, the employee, and the bespectacled guy had changed so dramatically. The voice replied that it didn't have an answer and suggested that they were just natural players. The main character wanted to say something, but the dialogue box turned red, making an incomprehensible sound, and it said, "Error." Li Huayang looked at the red dialogue box in surprise and asked what was going on. The red dialogue box says, Li Huayang is the only non-regressed player. To keep the balance in the game, this player will receive a unique skill. Search for a unique skill. The main character was surprised to ask about the fact that everyone regressed except him. To regress is to go back from the future to the past. This word is familiar to the main character because he has shouted many times in the middle of a brutal battlefield that he wants to take everything back. Li Huayang is on his knees in the middle of a bloody battlefield littered with corpses, shouting and holding up his palms. He thought that everything was getting clearer now from the message about the game being rebooted to how ordinary people dealt with orcs so easily. He remembered Kim Bo-on taking out an axe from a dead orc, a boy hitting the orc with a wrench, and a shop employee twisting a chain in the air. Li Huayang realized that all the system's nonsense was true, which meant that the report that he was the only player who didn't regress was probably also true. Gritting his teeth, he cursed and asked what the point was.
It was at this point that he realized that everyone else had regressed. Looking at the blue dialog box, Lee Hwa-young sighed and said that he would ask another question. The dialog box says, search for a unique skill. The woman slapped the main character on the back and asked what he was doing. She told him to go and help the others fight because he was so good at it. Turning to her with a grim expression, he said that when there were monsters in front of her, she was afraid to make a sound, so it was better for her to keep quiet. The woman was frightened. He asked her if she had regressed. She asked in surprise what it was. Lee Hwa-young replied that it means going back to the past from the future. She asked him what he was talking about. The protagonist calmly raised his eyebrows. Thanks to her, he understood something else. After seeing the strange creatures that suddenly appeared in the system messages, he began to realize that only those who became players regressed. As if trying to prove that they are from the future, these players kill orcs by attacking only their weak spots, and Lee Hwa-young is the only one who doesn't know the future. He frowned and pointed, deciding not to jump to conclusions. Kim Bo-on approached him and asked if he could introduce himself again. He said that he was the reason he was able to become a player, and he had been looking for him all his life from dungeon to dungeon all over Korea because he needed to meet him. He said with a smile that this day was what changed his life. Lee Hwa-young asked if this was true. Kim Bo-on said that if he hadn't helped him and given him a chainsaw, he would never have become a gambler and would have been hiding in the basement for the rest of his life like everyone else. The protagonist calmly thought that these were definitely the words of a person who had visited the future. Kim Bo-on said with a smile that the only reason he was successful as a player was because Lee Hwa-young was an example to him. The main character asked him if he knew him well. He replied that there wasn't a single player in Korea who didn't know him because he was the player who entered the last dungeon. Lee Hwa-young was surprised. He thought that as soon as he began to understand the situation a little, he was being told another term that he was hearing for the first time in his life. He started to say something and Kim Bo-on enthusiastically said that he was listening to him. Many admiring people gathered around him. The shop employee put her hand on her chest and said that it was a great honor to meet the player who entered the last dungeon, and she didn't know it back then. She said that she couldn't believe that the person she fought hand in hand with in the beginning was Lee Hwa-young. A boy with a wrench in his hand said that he would remember until the day he died how he entered the final dungeon, giving the middle finger to all the reporters. The protagonist thought about how all these people were fighting orcs. In other words, they are all regressed players. Kim Bo-on asked the main character to talk about what happened in the last dungeon. Lee Hwa-young noticed that they were always talking about a place called the last dungeon. A blue dialog box appeared in front of his face. The dialog box says, search for a unique skill completed. Please check the status window. The next blue dialog box says, butterfly effect, first level. As the only one who has not regressed, you will earn extra points for each action you take that changes the future. Lee Hwa-young's eyes widened in surprise. He understands perfectly well what the butterfly effect is. He thought that the flutter of a butterfly's wing might cause a hurricane on the other side of the planet. Looking at the dialog box, Lee Hwa-young thought about the extra points. A loud sound rang out, and everyone turned in the direction of the sound. Several orcs emerged from the rift. The regressors ran to attack. The main character with a calm face began to shoot from the machine gun and thought that just now the orcs had come running. Apart from the status window, after becoming a player, Lee Hwa-young started to see the name and level of the monster above his head. On the blue dialog box above the orc was written, Orc, second level. 2 shots hit the orc's head, pushing it back. The orc growled angrily, its eyes glowing red. The main character thought about the fact that bullets do almost no damage to orcs and firearms cannot penetrate their thick skin. Weapons that are not designed for combat only work against orcs because they are used by regressors. The regressors and orcs launched an attack on each other. Lee Hwa-young thought about how they had a clear understanding of the orcs' weaknesses, and they were aiming for the areas that weren't as strong as the rest of their bodies. The store employee threw the chain forward, wrapping it around the orc's leg. The main character does not shoot at orcs because the size of the cartridges is much smaller than the size of these hulks. Kim Bo-on will hit the orc in the leg with an axe. Even if the bullet did hit the orc's ligaments, the damage it would simply not be enough to disarm them. Lee Hwa-young handed the machine gun to the soldier. As he picked up the chainsaw from the floor, he thought that the power of regression was truly amazing. Looking ahead, he saw an axe. He raised the axe. The blue dialog box says, unique skill butterfly effect activated. You changed the future, plus 1 extra point. The main character asked in surprise if he had changed the future. He laid the axe on the floor and picked up the drill. A blue dialog box appeared in front of him, which says, Unique Skill Butterfly Effect activated. You change the future, plus 1 extra point. The orc charged at him from behind. Li Huaiyang abruptly threw the axe at him. The axe struck the orc in the knee. It clattered to the floor. The main character ran up to him and swung the axe. With a blow of his axe, he chopped off the orc's head. The blue dialog box says, Unique Skill Butterfly Effect activated. You change the future, plus 1 extra point. While climbing it, the main character asked Kim Bowen if he had used an axe last time. He replied that he used a chainsaw. With a slight smile, Li Huaiyang thought that he understood now. If he does something that he didn't do in the past, it is considered a change in the future. He's not entirely sure, but it all seems to fit. What he is doing now must be the opposite of what he did in his previous life. Kim Bowen told him that he had single-handedly killed 3 orcs in the past. The main character asked how. Kim Bowen pointed to the side. There were buckets of solvent on the shelves, a substance that helps make solidified paint running again, and it also ignites very well. Grinning, Li Huaiyang said it was interesting. Looking at the buckets of solvent, he thought that he had the same idea as before to set the orcs on fire with solvent. This means that if Li Huaiyang kills the orcs without using solvent, the future will be different. Or, for example, he can use it to kill all of them or not kill any of them. He took 1 bucket from the shelf. The blue dialog box says, Unique Skill Butterfly Effect activated. You changed the future, plus 1 extra point. Exhausted players agreed to participate in the main character's plan. They immobilized the orcs by destroying their Achilles tendons or knee joints, after which he poured solvent on them and then set them on fire. The blue dialog box says, Unique Skill Butterfly Effect activated. You changed the future, plus 1 extra point. Level up, plus 3 extra points. Li Huaiyang stands surrounded by flames. He thought that now he was convinced. If he does the opposite of what he did in the past, he will get extra points. He thought he didn't know what they were for, but that wasn't new. He thought that even without allocating points to his stats, he could chop off orcs' heads without any problems. The blue dialog boxes say, Brave Newbie Achievement received. This achievement is given to players who complete the hunt without spending extra points. For getting this achievement, you will receive a skill. Armor, first level, strengthens the player's defense. The strength of the armor is proportional to the strength characteristic of the player. Li Huaiyang raised his eyebrows in surprise as he looked at the dialog box. Blue energy enveloped him. His hands turned black. Looking down at his hands, he asked what they were. The guy gritted his teeth, cursed softly, and said that he thought he was going to get this skill this time. The girl with the metal pipe frowned and quietly asked when he even managed to get it. Turning to them, the main character asked what was wrong and if it was a problem that he got this skill. The guy and the girl were scared. The girl frowned and said that it was a problem because he was using it to crush the whole of Korea. The guy gritted his teeth and said he couldn't believe he'd missed out on getting it. Calmly raising his eyebrows, Li Huaiyang thought that it must have been his skill in the past, at least judging from the fact that the butterfly effect wasn't activated. The future only changes if he does something new, but the skill didn't activate when he got Brave Newbie in armor. The rift began to glow with purple energy. Kim Bowen, who was standing behind the main character, was looking at him with a cold gaze. They are facing a fault. The blue dialog box says, Orc and Goblin Dungeon. Goblins, 11. Orkov, 8. Maximum number of players, 4. Dungeon difficulty, D. Li Huaiyang thought that the goal of this game was definitely to destroy the human race. There are a fixed number of monsters in the dungeons, and after a certain amount of time, they come out of their gates and start destroying everything around them. He remembered Kim Bowen saying that there were 10 goblins in each wave, and there were exactly 10 minutes between each wave. He remembered the monsters coming out of the gate. He thought that this gate connected these dungeons full of monsters to the ground. Li Huaiyang thought that there was only one way to break them. He said that they needed to kill all the monsters as soon as possible. He thought that the number of monsters in the dungeon and the maximum number of players that can enter it are listed in the dungeon information. The difficulty of a dungeon is also important, as it shows how rare skills and items can be obtained in it. Li Huaiyang said that the difficulty of this dungeon means that there won't be anything higher than rare. Looking at the dialogue box, he thought that he had a reason to go there anyway. He wants to test something, or rather, test the stats he's gained in the newfound armor skill. He thought that since he had no information about the world, unlike the others, he needed a more obvious power, because the real power is physical power. The blue dialog box said, armor, first level, strengthens the player's defense. The strength of the armor is proportional to the strength characteristic of the player.
Extra points, 15.
The main character decided to invest all his points in strength.
The dialogue box says, force, 16.
He thought that he had defeated countless goblins and knew the weaknesses of the orcs, but he knew nothing about other dangers, so he would try out his abilities exactly where he would be almost completely safe.
Li Huaiyang went inside the portal.
Kim Bo-on, looking at her, thought that perhaps Li Huaiyang had gained something here in his previous life. The main character, a guy with a chainsaw, Kim Bo-on and a girl with a metal pipe came out of the portal.
They walk forward, looking around. A goblin looks at them from around the corners, grinning maliciously.
They turned when they saw him.
The goblin's charge hit them. The goblin bit the main character's arm.
His jaw dropped in surprise.
Li Huaiyang looked at him calmly. The blue dialogue box said, armor activated.
He reached out a black hand and grabbed the goblin's head.
He squeezed his hand, crushing the goblin's head with it.
The blue dialogue box says, you changed the future, plus 1 extra point.
Li Huaiyang thought that it hadn't even been 5 hours since the game started and his strength was already 16.
The main character opened his hand and the goblin's corpse plopped to the ground.
The girl said in a frightened voice that it was impossible.
The boy gritted his teeth, cursed and said in surprise that he had crushed the goblin's skull with one hand.
Kim Bo-on approached Li Huaiyang and asked how. He said that the armor skill was the only one in the world and it was probably because of it that he was considered the strongest player in Korea in his previous life.
The main character asked indifferently, so what?
Kim Bo-on said he needed it more.
He took the chainsaw out of the guy's hand and threw it at Li Huaiyang.
He frowned in surprise.
Using his armor, he blocked the blow with his hand.
The chainsaw blade sparkled as it rested against the protagonist's black arm. Chuckling horribly, he thought that even if he hadn't regressed, it shouldn't be like this. He decided it was his turn and held up a black hand. He grabbed the chainsaw blade in his hand and squeezed the chainsaw bent in his hand. Li Huaiyang threw the chainsaw from Kim Bo-on's hand to the floor. The main character grabbed him by the neck. There was a blue dialogue box above Kim Bo-on's head that said, Level 3. Li Huaiyang squeezed his throat and he was trying to say something. The main character looked at him with a dead look and thought, what a pity. He thought about how greed breeds destruction. The war teaches this and he even has a scar that now serves as a reminder. He guessed that they thought that since they had regressed to the hardware store and he hadn't yet managed to get all the skills he had in his previous life, they would be able to pick them up. Holding Kim Bo-on by the neck above the ground, the protagonist turned to the others and asked if there were any more applicants. They opened their mouths in fright. He told them to leave. Li Huaiyang continued to squeeze Kim Bo-on's neck. There was a crunch and he dropped it to the ground. He thought about how letting go of his enemies during the war wasn't a thank you, but a rain of bullets. And so it has always been. Li Huaiyang said that now that it started, the law doesn't mean anything. He thought that he knew very well that letting his emotions get in the way of dealing with those who had threatened his life at least once was unacceptable. He looked at the boy and girl and gave them a threatening look and told them to get out of his sight if they valued their lives. Li Huaiyang thought about how cruel this game is because the inventory window appears above the deceased player to make it easier to pick up their items. A blue inventory dialog box appeared above Kim Bo-on's body. After clicking a button on the dialog box, Li Huaiyang said it was convenient. The blue dialog box says, Goblin Champion Necklace, Strength plus 3, Agility plus 3. In his hand was a necklace with a blue glowing stone. After putting it around his neck, he said that he now owned it. The necklace turned red. The dialog box says, you changed the future, plus 1 extra point. He thought that 3 points of strength and agility was quite a lot. It gets 3 bonus points when a level is obtained, which means this necklace is equivalent to 2 levels. He thought that even though the more he leveled up, the less effect it would have, it was quite significant in the early stages. The guy crouched down next to Kim Bo-on's body and asked why he was wearing it. He said it was kind of tasteless. The main character picked up a chainsaw from the floor, walking towards the orc. He shoved the chainsaw into the orc's mouth. Swinging it up, he sliced the orc's head in half. Li Huaiyang said that he doesn't feel the difference. He thought that 3 points of strength to his 15 wasn't a small increase, but he still didn't feel any different. The blue dialog box says, all monsters in the dungeon have been killed. The dungeon will soon be destroyed. Exit time, 3 minutes. You can only destroy the gate by killing all the monsters inside. When all the monsters die, the spatial rift disappears without a trace.
This is exactly what Lee Wai-young was talking about when he said that the laws no longer make sense. Even regressed players don't know what happens to those who remain in the rift after the gate disappears. No one has yet returned from them to tell because their bodies are disappearing along with the gate. The main character goes to the portal, his jacket is torn in front. He thought that was why they gave him time to go out. He glanced at Kim Bo-won, who was lying motionless on the floor. He noticed a boy standing in front of him. Lee Wai-young realized that it was a boy who wanted to buy a wrench. He asked him if he wanted to share the fate of Kim Bo-won. The boy replied that he wanted to stay with him. The main character refused him and urged him to leave. The boy begged him to let him follow him. Lee Wai-young frowned, grabbing him by the shoulders and telling him to stop. The main character clicked on a dialog box with a status window. The blue dialog box says, Strength, 25 plus 3. He thought that with the boost from the Goblin Champion necklace, his type strength was 28. He now had more power than a level 9 player who had invested all the points in it. When he noticed the boy crying, he said he told him to stop. The boy was crying, clutching his t-shirt. Pressing a hand to his chest, he told him that they had regressed 10 years into the past. Lee Wai-young told him not to whine and be a man. Clenching his fists in front of him, the boy shouted that even in 10 years his life will not change and he wants to be a hero for once, so he asks him about it. He shouted that he wanted to be the hero's assistant. Grinning, Lee Wai-young said that he was a funny guy. He thought that his name was Kim Min-soo and the only reason he was interested in him was because he knew the future 10 years in advance. Kim Min-soo clenched his fists and said that he wanted his life to mean something and asked him to help with it. He said he wouldn't disgrace his name. When Kim Min-soo regressed, he hoped to change his life for the better. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't just him who regressed, which means that nothing can be changed. This is an ordinary player who kills monsters and clears small dungeons for 10 years. It seems to him that being a psychic of the main character of Korea will be better. With a grin, Lee Wai-young thought that he felt like he wasn't far off the mark and that his head was working. They exit the portal. The main character asks that he does not want to just be a henchman. Kim Min-soo replied with a smile that when he became the world's top man, he would be his right-hand man. He said that he is number one and he commands everything. Lee Wai-young said that he needed to see if it would be of any use. He asked him to name 10 people he would meet in the future, their names, faces, and levels. He added that it doesn't matter to him whether they are friends or enemies and he needs this information. Kim Min-soo said he understood. The main character with a gloomy look told him not to even think about deceiving him and that his age would not stop him. He told him to call him when he was done. They exchanged phone numbers. Kim Min-soo ran out of the building happily. Lee Wai-young smiled and said that he was really funny. 3 days have passed since the regression of all players. At first, the players hid the fact of regression. There are many reasons. For example, they could easily be considered crazy. Just the appearance of monsters is not enough to make people believe in time travel as well. Also, the regressors wanted to live a different life than the last one. Therefore, they did not want to share information about the future. Monsters are raging in the city. Regressors felt that regression was a great chance to change their lives as the main character of the novel would have done. However, the fact that everyone regressed made becoming the main character a pipe dream. News and social networks are full of information about the game. The headlines read, Regressors, people from the future. The stock market is on edge. Don't believe scammers who pretend to be regressors. Who will be elected president in 2024? About the last dungeon in 2030, the sports betting industry is temporarily shutting down. Chief Executive Officer of one of the companies, too many people know the results of the game. This isn't profitable for us. The blue dialog box says, you change the future. Plus 1 extra point, the main character is sitting on the couch and watching TV. The man on the TV introduced himself as Yoon Moon-young. He said that there was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions, the whole world turned into a game, and with its onset, all players regressed. He said that they will discuss it today and with them today is Lee Dong-guk, director of the Asia-Pacific Players Association. He greeted him. Lee Dong-guk greeted him back. The host said that many players are now in turmoil and those who have not awakened as a player are particularly susceptible to this feeling. He asked if he could explain to them what the phenomenon was. Lee Dong-guk responded that for ordinary people who didn't become players, this situation became much better with the fact of regression. He said that just because the players protecting them from the monsters had regressed, it meant that they would be able to gain strength much faster. He said that with the protection of players, their lives will not change much and he believes there is absolutely nothing to worry about. He added that the only problem may be players demanding money for information about the future and otherwise there is nothing that needs to be mentioned. The host said that, in other words, the ability of players to become stronger is a plus for humanity. He asked why this was happening, why the players were regressing, and what happened in the last dungeon. Lee Wai-young noticed the mention of the last dungeon. Lee Dong-guk replied that many people wonder if the players regressed because of what happened in the last dungeon and this question is no doubt justified. He added that the regression occurred 3 hours after 21 of the chosen players from all over the world entered the dungeon. The main character said that it turns out that after 10 years, the last dungeon appears in 3 hours after 21 people enter it, all players regressed. The host said that the last dungeon might be the end of this game. He asked me what had happened there. We're calling that Lee Dong-guk, director of the Asia-Pacific Players Association, is with them today. He said that they will continue after the commercial break. Lee Wai-young cursed. Grinning, he asked about the strongest player. Listening to their conversation, he finally understood why the players in the construction shop called him the childish word hero. He was looking out the window. The blue dialogue box says, "You changed the future." Plus 1 extra point, Lee Wai-young noticed that he was given a point for the film. He thought that perhaps in his previous life, he hadn't even bothered to prepare the windows for winter. Lee Wai-young thought that almost everything he did here gave him extra points and it seemed like he hadn't returned home at this time in his previous life. He got 1 point each for drinking water and sitting on the couch. He'll think he doesn't have time to catch his breath. The blue dialogue box says, extra points, 37. He thought that the number of points accumulated could not but please. He asked how he was able to become the strongest player in Korea and enter the last dungeon without this unbalanced skill. Grinning, he thought that the reason he was interested was not just curiosity but anticipation. As a child, Lee Wai-young learned that the weak always give up to the strong. Thanks to this, he also realized that he needed to become the strongest one. He remembered 2 guys grabbing him by the collar in the alley. The main character chose money as the source of power and later sold his life to countless wars to increase his value. Even in a world where the concept of a better person didn't exist, he wanted to be one. He thought that now there was such a title after all. The TV reporter was happily counting down from 5 to 1. He happily pointed his finger at 3 statues and said that they were statues of players Lee Wai-young, Park Moo-sun, and Choi Chul-sundae. He explained that they entered the last dungeon as representatives of Korea. The crowd cheered loudly. Lee Wai-young was petrified in surprise. When he saw his statue on the TV screen, he said it was him. As he gripped the TV screen with his hands, he thought about what those statues had done just 3 days after all the players regressed and apparently, in his previous life, he really was an incredible player. Among the mercenaries, it was the most expensive, but that didn't mean anything, because a consumable is still a consumable. It didn't bother him, because he was only doing it for the money. However, now he sees that a cult is practically being built around him. The reporter said that the fact that after the representatives of each state entered the last dungeon, all the other players regressed means that something happened inside. He asked if they should ask the 3 Korean players, Lee Wai-young, Park Moo-sun, and Choi Chul-sun, about what happened there. He said they were there, so they should know. Lee Wai-young said that he was curious himself. The voice on the TV said that all 3 of them were now in hiding. The reporter asked if people who should be revered as heroes had disappeared without a trace. The voice said it was just like that. He said that these are the people who entered the last dungeon at the end of the game, in other words, the strongest players in Korea. When they entered the last dungeon, they were filled to the brim with unique items and skills, which means that now that they are back in the present, only they know the location of these unique and legendary items and skills. The host asked if they were hiding for their own safety. The man replied that it was true, and other players also want to get these items and skills because their strength corresponds to their rarity. The host said that he had heard that the World Players Association had issued a new decree. The man agreed and said that players who entered the last dungeon in their previous life would be forgiven for all their crimes. The host frowned and asked if they were sure that this decree was necessary. The man replied that players from different countries still need to follow the laws of their respective countries, and this rule was established by the World Players Association, but another provision was added to the law. He said to talk about the reason for this. The main character turned off the TV and said that he understood. He learned 2 interesting things. First, there are a lot of people hunting him. The second is that it is legal for him to beat them until they lose their pulse. He put on a sweatshirt and picked up a black face mask. The blue dialogue box in front of him said that he had changed the future and received an extra point. Wearing a mask over his face and a hood over his head, Lee Wai-young runs down the city street. He thought about how no matter how much he thought about it, he didn't have a single reason to go to Gwanghwamun Square in his previous life, and since he didn't do it in his previous life, just going there would change the future. And, as if to confirm his words, system notifications pop up with each completed step. There are 2 blue dialogue boxes in front of it. One has a status window and the other says, Special Skill, Butterfly Effect, First Level. The blue dialogue boxes say, additional points have been applied to the Dexterity attribute. Dexterity, 55. Lee Wai-young pushed off the ground and exhaled. He thought that the unwritten rules about spending extra points, such as that strength is the best stat for early play, or that those who spend mana quickly should spend it, meant nothing to him, because he was gaining points at a completely different rate from the rest of the players. The main character quickly runs along the street. It occurred to him that the usual rules simply didn't apply to him. Lee Wai-young jumped from the roof of a building. He landed flat on his feet. He looked ahead, his eyes glowing red. Lee Wai-young stands in the square amid a crowd of people. He looked at his statue, which says, Shadow of Death, Lee Wai-young. Adjusting the brim of his cap, he said he couldn't believe it. If being chosen to enter the last dungeon is so significant, as they said on TV, the main character assumed that he would be recognized, so he had to prepare. He doesn't want to attract too much attention, and all he needs right now is information about his future. When he was a mercenary, he kept appearing on TV to increase his value, but that's beside the point now. He thought that everyone was thinking the same thing. Regressed players will not hide their desires from him. They want to get information from him, and they think he has it. However, this is not the case because it has not regressed. They don't know that, and they don't know something else. He had a new power that he didn't have in his previous life. Kim Bo-on was one of them. In any case, Lee Wai-young was now the target of the greed-blinded players. The main character narrowed his eyes with distaste. The players in the square were armed. Most likely, their goal is simply to attract attention. They could put it away in the inventory. With the title of heroes who will save the world from monsters, players also gained fame. Lee Wai-young thought that if he took off his mask in front of them, this place would become a slaughterhouse, but he needed other players. He had seen these 3 statues being worshipped on the TV broadcast. He thought that to these people, he was something like a deity. They wouldn't do it if they didn't know anything about him, no matter how exaggerated the stories are, but unlike the broadcast, he doesn't see them here. The statue of a man with a cloak draped over his shoulders reads, We are here to save humanity. Thank you for all your support. The King of Poisons, Choi Chul Sunday. On the statue of a guy leaning his hands on his sword, it says, We'll go in there and end this game once and for all. The Emperor of the Sword, Park Mu-sung. The statue of Lee Wai-young had 2 horizontal lines and 1 vertical line, meaning the middle finger, and was written, Shadow of Death, Lee Wai-young. Folding his arms across his chest, Lee Wai-young shook his head at the words about the Shadow of Death. He saw the guy with the mace blow his statue's head off. The blue dialogue box said, You changed the future, plus 1 extra point. The guy wearing a white jacket grinned viciously. It landed in front of the protagonist, and the statue's head fell to the ground. He put the weapon away in the dialogue box. Lee Wai-young looked at him calmly. The guy grinned. They stand facing each other in a cloud of dust. Turning around, the guy started running away from him. Lee Wai-young thought that now that his agility was more than 50 points, controlling his speed wasn't so easy. The blue dialogue box says, You changed the future, plus 1 extra point. He ran after the guy. They run through the streets. Lee Wai-young grabbed the boy's neck. He held it up off the ground and asked if he knew it. With a sinister smile, the main character said that this means that he knows where he started running off to. The boy tried to draw his weapon, but Lee Wai-young grabbed his arm and told him not to even think about it. He snatched the mace out of his hands, thanking him and saying that he would need it. The blue dialogue box says, You changed the future, plus 1 extra point. The blue dialogue box says, Mace of the Orc Champion. Chance to stun the enemy 25%, plus 30 damage, plus 10 strength. Lee Wai-young asked who he works for. He thought that he was definitely from the guild, because it was impossible to get a rare weapon while being a loner and even in 5 days. He squeezed his neck and asked if he had watched the interview. He recalled that it was an interview with the director of the World Players Association and asked if he remembered what he said. He said that if he tried any tricks, he wouldn't even have a bloodstain left. The guy laughed nervously and demanded to let him go. Lee Wai-young said with a grim face that he had 10 seconds. He asked who he was and where he came from. Startled, the boy replied that he was Kim Chang-bai from the General Guild. Lee Wai-young told him to continue. After that, Kim Chang-bai finally gave up. The main character asked about Lee Wai-young's project. He thought that according to him, Lee Wai-young's project was the name of the General Guild's operation, the essence of which was to take over all the skills and items that he had collected in his previous life. He asked what would come first and said that if he didn't want to feed himself worms, he'd better talk. Kim Chang-bai said in a frightened voice that it was stealth. He apologized and asked me not to kill him. He said it would be in 3 days at the gate to the werewolf dungeon. Lee Wai-young told him to tell me more. The guy said that the werewolf dungeon where Lee Wai-young obtained the rare stealth skill would be opened in 3 days. He asked how they knew all this. Kim Chang-bai thought about why he was asking something that he knew about. He said he didn't know where they got this information from, but it was reliable. He shouted that he knew because it was his skill. Lee Wai-young asked how they were going to steal all of his skills. Kim Chang-bai said that 3 days before the dungeon opens, about 100 players will be on full alert and they are confident that he will come for the skill that he had in the past. The main character thought that it would not be easy to face 100 regressed players. He frowned, thinking. The dialogue box says, "You changed the future." Plus 1 extra point, Kim Min-soo soon arrived. He said Kim Chang-bai was lying and asked if he could just kill him. Lee Wai-young said that they would first listen to what he collected and then make a decision. Kim Min-soo said that the nobodies from the General Guild are targeting the stealth skill. With a smile, the protagonist turned to Kim Chang-bai and said that one of them was lying. The blue dialogue box says, "You changed the future." Plus 1 extra point. He thought that Kim Chang-bai and Kim Min-soo were talking about the same thing and he could only listen and compare their information. Kim Chang-bai shouted that the werewolf dungeon would open tomorrow. The blue dialogue box says, "You changed the future." Plus 1 extra point. Lee Wai-young smiled and asked him what that meant. Pointing his finger at Kim Min-soo, Kim Chang-bai said that he was lying. He asked if he was ill. Kim Chang-bai accused him of trying to deceive everyone. The main character walked up to them and held out his black hands. He grabbed them by the neck, lifting them off the ground, and told them to prove their case one by one. Kim Min-soo took out his phone from his pocket and showed it to Lee Wai-young. The phone screen says, "Still no news about Lee Wai-young. Will he show up at the werewolf dungeon on January 7th? The main character said that the 7th of January is tomorrow. Kim Min-soo nodded in satisfaction. Looking at his phone, Kim Min-soo said that the werewolf dungeon appeared in the first days of the game, and due to the characteristics of werewolves, it was quite difficult for beginners to kill them. He said that their attack speed is many times faster than that of goblins and orcs and they gather in packs. He showed the screen of Lee Wai-young's phone and said that because of this, no one was able to win at the beginning of the game and the dungeon was eventually forgotten, and as a result, werewolves came out of it. Kim Min-soo said that this is why the werewolf dungeon is quite famous among players and these monsters from the nearest cities did not leave a stone unturned. Lee Wai-young asked about the fact that everyone knows where it is. Dungeons and gates weren't a problem for the unawakened. At the beginning of the game, they attracted a lot of attention due to the absurd unreality of what was happening. However, over time, the novelty was replaced by routine. Every time the gate opened, the unawakened ones either received an evacuation message or an army quickly moved in and secured the area around the gate. Above the ground, a red portal glowed, surrounded by police officers who asked to stay away from here. The only thing that ordinary people needed to do was to stay out of the way. When the players woke up and got used to the game, life went back to normal. However, the gate to the werewolf dungeon was on a different level. Monsters ran out of them and mercilessly destroyed the nearest cities when the game was just beginning. Now everyone hopes that a strong player will appear who can deal with the werewolves, so the location of the gate and the fact that there are werewolves inside it is known to ordinary people. With a frown, Kim Min-soo shouted that this dungeon was destroyed by Lee Wai-young in his previous life. The main character asked Kim Chang-bai if he was right. The blue dialogue box said, "You changed the future, plus 1 extra point." He said he would ask him one last question. Frowning, Lee Wai-young asked who gave him the order to smash his statue. Kim Chang-bai cursed and stuck his hand into the blue dialogue box. The main character clenched his hand and there was a crunch. The blue dialogue box says, "You changed the future, plus 1 extra point." He opened his hands. Kim Chang-bai fell to the ground, dead. Kim Min-soo gave him a startled look. Lee Wai-young noticed the dialogue box and said that it meant that he didn't kill him in his previous life. A werewolf dungeon opens on January 7th, which is tomorrow. In the past, no one could destroy it when it first opened. In other words, no player had the strength to do so. However, now that everyone has regressed, the situation is different. Folding his arms across his chest, Lee Wai-young speculated that a substance might kill werewolves, just as rat poison kills rats. He said that he needed to learn more about this dungeon. Kim Min-soo asked why he needed information about places he had been to before. He asked if he knew the best about them. The main character raised an eyebrow and said that it was because he didn't regress. He told him to shut up and said the interrogation was over. Kim Min-soo looked at him in surprise. After thinking about it, he said that the most important thing was that it was a level 5 dungeon. He asked what his level was and said that if it was less than 5th, then he wouldn't be able to enter. Lee Wai-young spread his hands in surprise. Gritting his teeth, he asked about the fact that he needed to be level 5. Squinting, he thought that the level didn't mean much to him. The status window says Lee Wai-young level 2, stamina 1, strength 28, mana 1, agility 55, concentration 1, bonus points 162, achievements brave beginner, skills, first level butterfly effect, first level armor. Lee Wai-young thought that he had used a total of 80 points and including the ones in reserve, that made a total of 242 points. Each level is awarded 3 points and if you divide 242 by 3, you get about 80. The main character felt that his stats were now at the level of a level 80 player. Kim Min-soo spread his hands and said that even at his current level, it would be difficult for him to kill werewolves. He added that other players won't just stand by and watch either. With a frown, Lee Wai-young said that the problem was the level. He thought that even with such stats, he couldn't enter the dungeon because his actual level was lower than that of the werewolves. He told Kim Min-soo to show him where he could level up. Raising his hand, he replied that only the orc and goblin gates were open now and new gates would open over time, just like the werewolf gate tomorrow. He added that only 4 days have passed since the start of the game. The main character asked about goblins and orcs. Kim Min-soo said that monsters like goblins and orcs are usually not interesting to him. Raising his eyebrows, Lee Wai-young said that they were cute. The blue dialogue box says, additional points have been applied to the strength attribute. Strength 190. The main character clenched a black hand wrapped in a blue aura. The blue dialogue box says, armor, first level, enhances and strengthens the player's body. The strength of the armor is proportional to the strength characteristic of the player. Wrapped in a blue aura, he asked Kim Min-soo if anyone in his past life had broken through his armor. Spreading his hands, he said that he didn't know because they didn't always go together. He said that he could definitely tell that the title on his statue, Shadow of Death, was given because of the armor. Lee Wai-young said it was kind of childish. Across from them were a few goblins who were smiling maliciously. By increasing the strength stat, Lee Wai-young not only increased his physical strength but also the strength of his armor. He leaped forward, breaking the floor beneath him. Kim Min-soo covered his face with his hands. The blue dialogue box says, Dexterity, 55. The main character jumped on the goblins, swinging a black hand. He crushed the goblin's head to the ground with his hand. The blue dialogue box says, you changed the future, plus 1 extra point. The main character thought that with his strength and agility, they didn't stand a chance. He punched the other goblin in the face with a calm face. The blue dialogue box says, you changed the future, plus 1 extra point. Leaning his foot on a dead goblin, Lee Wai-young said that he recently saw something on the internet. He asked what a skill stone was. He added that if he swallowed one, they would give him a skill. Kim Min-soo pondered and thought about how he didn't know what even non-players knew. He asked if he really hadn't regressed, unlike them. He thought that he was too strong for a non-regressor. Lee Wai-young irritably shouted at him to just answer the question. Kim Min-soo was scared. He said that the skill stone is literally a stone that has a skill in it and it is located near the monster's heart. He said that the skill stones are about half the size of a human fist and the color of their glow indicates what class the skill is inside, white normal, purple rare, yellow unique, red legendary. Kim Min-soo said that stealth, which is rumored to be in the werewolf dungeon, is a rare skill and its gem will glow purple. Lee Wai-young raised an eyebrow and asked what the skill class meant. Kim Min-soo replied that, in short, different classes show how many copies of each skill exist and rare and lower skills have more copies. He explained that, for example, there are several stealth stones in the world, so even if you get it in the werewolf dungeon, someone in the world will also have one. The blue dialogue box says, Stealth Skill Gem. The main character asked if this means that the stones of the legendary and unique classes are one at a time. Kim Min-soo held up his index finger and smiled, saying that it was true and skills also have levels. He explained that the higher the level, the stronger the skill and various effects can be added to them.
Lee Wai-young asked what about the unique skills?
Kim Min-soo's eyes widened in surprise. He asked what unique skills were. The main character asked if he knew about the unique skills. Lee Wai-young looked at the blue dialogue box that said, Butterfly Effect, First Level. As the only one who has not regressed, you will earn extra points for each action you take that changes the future. Kim Min-soo scratched his head in confusion.
The main character indifferently told him that it didn't matter. Lee Wai-young walks down the street.
He and Kim Min-soo hid around the corner of the building. Above the main character's head is written, Lee Wai-young, Level 5. Kim Min-soo asked what their plan was. Pointing his finger at the square, Lee Wai-young said that he would do everything himself. He told him to go there and find out what they were going to do and tell him if there was anything interesting. Kim Min-soo nodded with glowing eyes. The main character thought that he directly exuded loyalty. He thought that the gate of the werewolf dungeon would soon appear here, and seeing 100 players from the general guild waiting for Lee Wai-young to appear, he realized that Kim Chang-bai wasn't lying about everything.
The first point of Lee Wai-young's plan is to enter the gate as soon as it appears.
A limited number of players can enter the dungeon and the number for each is different. According to Kim Min-soo, only 5 people can enter the werewolf dungeon. He thought that he needed to enter before the 5-player limit was exhausted, and if it didn't work out, then those people would kill the werewolves and get the stone.
Lee Wai-young looked at the watch on his wrist and said that there were 7 minutes left.
A voice in the crowd shouted that this was where Lee Wai-young obtained the rare stealth skill in his previous life. The blonde-haired guy raised his fist and shouted that the gate would open in 5 minutes and that today would be the day when the general guild would take the lead. He shouted that they were using Lee Wai-young's skill to leave an even bigger mark on history than he did. The crowd cheered. He shouted that Lee Wai-young hadn't shown up yet and told them not to let their guard down because they didn't know when he was coming. Grinning, he thought that he was already here.
On the dialogue box in front of him was written, the gate will appear in 30 seconds. Werewolf Dungeon, Level 5. There are a maximum of 25 werewolves. Number of players, 5.
Dungeon difficulty, a crowd of people with dialogue boxes in front of them counted from 10 to 1. When they counted, a huge red gate appeared in front of them.
The guy urged them to go ahead and make history.
The guy waved to his friend and said that he would be back soon. The guy in the black shirt said that these werewolves were nothing to them, the regressors. The yellow-haired guy shouted at him not to die in the dungeon. They turned around and saw Lee Wai-young running towards the gate. When they recognized him, they took up arms and attacked him. Someone shouted that Lee Wai-young was here and ordered him to contact the headquarters. The main character thought that only 5 days had passed since the regression of all players, and if you think logically, a person with agility above 50 could not appear, but he does not care about logic. Lee Wai-young quickly ran past the armed men. One person in the crowd asked why he was so fast. Another exclaimed that such dexterity simply could not exist. Another voice urged them to run after him and not stand still. The main character ran into the portal, and in front of the guy who was chasing him, a red dialogue box appeared on which it was written, the limit of players is exhausted.
You can't log in.
Kim Min-soo opened his mouth in surprise.
Lee Wai-young and a few people are standing in the night forest.
They look at the main character in fright, and someone said his name. He thought that having them all regressed was quite convenient because they knew who he was and he didn't even have to explain anything. Lee Wai-young smiled calmly and said, exactly. Blue dialogue boxes appeared next to the guys, and the guy with blue hair told everyone to be ready. They stuck their hands into the blue dialogue boxes. They ran to attack the main character while swinging their green whips. The blue dialogue box says, Goblin Chieftain's Whip, low damage, allows the wearer to control goblins, damage, +1. Lee Wai-young used the armor skill and his arms and neck turned black, the whips wrapped around his arms and neck. The blue dialogue box says, you change the future, +1 extra point. They pulled on the whips, spreading the protagonist's arms in different directions. The guy with the blue hair was looking at the blue dialogue box. He took out the net. Lee Wai-young rolled his eyes in surprise and thought that they immediately realized that they were no match for him, so they decided to tie him up because their punches wouldn't have any effect. Grinning, he noted that this was a good plan and thought that they were trying very nicely.
Lee Wai-young knelt down next to the bound guys wrapped in the net.
He said with a grin that it was a good try and it was a pity that it didn't work out.
He turned as the snarling wolf approached. Several evil black wolves approached him. Lee Wai-young asked why they were so angry. The wolf's eyes glowed red and saliva was coming out of its mouth.
The main character asked if this was normal for them. He asked the guys if they would like to be a snack for them. They pleaded with him, saying what they didn't want and just did as they were told. With a serious face, he asked them who. The wolves growled angrily. They launched an attack on Lee Wai-young. The blue-haired guy said in a frightened voice that Lee Wai-young was trapped. The guy in the black shirt said the werewolves had caught him. The guy with the blue hair sighed and said that it looked like they were going to die like this. The wolves attacked the main character, who was lying on the ground. One of the wolves twitched. Lee Wai-young rose to his feet, holding up a black fist. The wolves scattered. The blue dialogue box says, "You changed the future, plus 1 extra point." The main character exhaled. The 2 blue dialogue boxes say, "You changed the future, plus 1 extra point." The guys ask in surprise how this is possible. Lee Wai-young said that he had to remember it once, and it seems that this also applies to them. He stood with a bloody black hand, surrounded by wolves. A bloodied wolf lay on the ground. Like wolves, dogs have elongated muzzles. Dogs and wolves are very similar. If you grab a dog by the muzzle and close its jaw, it will think that you are stronger. Lee Wai-young found out about this a few years ago on a mission to track down smugglers. After being bitten by a guard dog, he grabbed its muzzle with one hand and looked it straight in the eye. He never tried to attack him again. Lee Wai-young thought that he had spared the dog back then, but they weren't animals, they were monsters. The wolf leapt at him, snarling and snarling. The main character squeezed the wolf's mouth with his hands and decided to put more strength into the grip and turn their muzzles into a mess. He crushed the wolf's face with his hands, spilling blood. The boys looked at him in shock, amazed at his strength. Lee Wai-young thought that unlike goblins and orcs, werewolves had strong bones. He punched the wolf in the face. They thought that since they had regressed, they knew exactly the difference in physical strength between a level 2 orc and a level 5 werewolf, and Lee Wai-young's strength was beyond the limit. Several wolves are looking at the main character surrounded by dead wolves. The guy in the black shirt asked why he didn't kill everyone. The main character calmly replied that he didn't need the gate to disappear just yet. When all the monsters die, the dungeon collapses and the gate disappears. Lee Wai-young is going to get out of this dungeon as soon as he finds the werewolf with the skill stone, because the general guild players are waiting for him outside. He remembered the guy who commanded the rest of the crowd. If the gate disappeared, they would know that he had killed all the werewolves and taken the skill stone, and they would definitely want to turn Korea upside down to find it. To avoid this trouble, Lee Wai-young decided not to kill all the werewolves, but to quietly slip through the gate. 2 wolves with bloody mouths growl angrily. 3 wolves rushed to attack the main character. He looked at them with a calm face and said that it wouldn't be enough. It disappeared in front of their eyes and was behind them, hitting the 3 wolves. Whimpering, they fell to the ground. Lee Wai-young walked up to the terrified guys and addressed them. After the game began, rifts in space and time opened up all over the earth, and monsters rained down from these rifts, causing irreparable damage to civilization. Everyone knew that this was the end of humanity. To deal with this destructive force, a game system was introduced. In order to stop the apocalypse, you need to kill all the monsters in all the dungeons. Apart from a small group of fanatics, there are almost no religious people left. A man in a black hoodie shouts that they accept the will of the Lord and realize the mistakes of humanity and asks them to stop this game. People in green robes, hands folded, repeat after him. They shout that they believe the goblins are little messengers of God. Lee Wai-young thought that it was impossible for God or Buddha to send monsters that were only seen in games before. And while people didn't know what to believe, a new faith emerged in the form of guilds. The crowd cheers on the men with swords who got out of the car. Someone is shouting that the common guild is their only savior in this world. Lee Wai-young thought that he was right when he said the word faith. In addition to fans, they also have parishioners. This way, there was nothing stopping the guilds from getting bigger and bigger. They were fighting among themselves for possession of the dungeons. What fell from the monsters could be used as a source of energy and even make weapons from it, which could help in further clearing the dungeons. In addition, skill stones from dungeons can be sold to players for a lot of money. In other words, owning a dungeon brings huge profits. And in addition to the material benefits, closing these gates, which are capable of enormous destruction, brings a lot of public approval. Lee Wai-young thought that the guild was both a business and a religion. He asked the guys who was in charge. The guy lying on the ground said in a frightened voice that it was Choi Chul-sung.